All right, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? All right. I think I'm at the wrong conference because I came to talk about cooking, and apparently this is an IT conference. So it's going to be a really awkward moment where I try to talk about lasagna, and you're going to be like, this is not programming. I'll wait for the door. All right, so today we're going to talk about how lasagna is better than spaghetti, at least from a programming perspective. And more specifically, we'll be talking about JSON, REST, and Alpha, and how you can use these standards to build fine-grained authorization within your applications. My name's David. I'm with Axiomatics, a company that implements a standard called XACML, XACML. How many people have heard of XACML before? All right. How many people use XACML? Okay. I wish it was the other way around. But anyway, so before we begin, we have a booth outside in the exhibitor space, and we will be doing a draw to win a set of one speaker, actually, not a set of speakers. So if you want to drop your business card over there, you might get a chance to win the speakers. You don't get bonus points for being here today. So a little history of pasta. Meet Sally. Sally is your average mom. She cooks, she bakes for her family, for her kid. And one thing she does a lot is spaghetti because it's extremely easy. And it's very convenient. You can do it in a couple minutes and you're done. Now, the problem is that she's got a little precious one. And her baby has a very different relationship to food than most of us do. So the food, instead of ending in the baby's mouth, ends up pretty much everywhere else. Now, I don't have a baby myself yet, but I don't look forward to having to pick up the spaghetti. Which is why some really smart Italian person invented lasagna. Because it's so much harder to, or I would think, it's so much harder to spread the lasagna around than it is to do it with spaghetti. So lasagna, from a pure cooking perspective, is much cleaner and much more organized than spaghetti. And to the extent that you'd think that the Germans invented it instead of the Italians. Now, how does that relate to programming, you might wonder? Well, you've all heard the expression spaghetti code, right? You all know what that is, and hopefully, since you're at Cloud Identity Summit, none of you write spaghetti code. It happens to me sometimes. And more specifically, with respect to authorization, spaghetti code is the idea that you write your business logic, you write your cool new mobile app, and then you're going to pepper around, no joke intended, you're going to pepper around some authorization logic, and then your code happens to be a big negative medley of business logic and authorization logic, and even maybe authentication logic while you're at it, and you end up with spaghetti, with messy, hard to eat, hard to separate spaghetti where you don't know anymore which one is the business logic, which one is the authorization logic. So you end up in a big mess. That's whipping yourself, but I was going to ask who feels that their code is like spaghetti? I guess no one is going to raise their hands. Okay, 1, 2. Wow, cool. So is mine. If we relate the spaghetti analogy to access control more specifically, bear in mind that in the title, when I said authorization, I had access control in mind, not authorization from the OAuth perspective. Authorization from the OAuth perspective is more about authorization delegation, if you will, or authentication plus plus, but it's not access control per se. So if you look at access control historically, you had very well-known models, such as discrete access control, mandatory access control, which over time and with the growth of information, the growth of services, the growth of applications has changed or adapted into role-based access control. And I'm guessing that everyone here is familiar with RBAC. It's not anything new to anyone, right? So role-based access control is a great, very mature, very widespread model, but it focuses all too much on the role, or it focuses all too much on the user. And when you do that, you've got to compensate for the limitations of RBAC in your code. And whoop, here we go again. We're back into spaghetti mode. So then a new model that has been on the rise for the last few years, NIST wrote a report about it, which was released early in 2014. is ABAC, attribute-based access control. The idea with ABAC is that you're going to go beyond just the user, and you'll address additional attributes about the user, of course, but also about other items. So our secret ingredient in delivering good authorization for APIs, for web services, for mobile apps, for databases, is, of course, attributes. Attributes, attributes, attributes. That's the A part of ABAC. And attributes will help you to define new authorization scenarios that do not focus only on the user, but also on the resource, on the action, on the environment. Attributes, as a matter of fact, they can describe pretty much anything. They can describe the user, the user trying to access, the subject of the access. They can describe the resource, the targeted item. What is it you're trying to work on? You're working on a document. You're working on an API. So you want to describe that API. Attributes can be used to describe also the action you want to do. Is it a delete? Is it a view? Is it an update? And potentially other attributes of the action. Usually I only think of an action ID, but you could think of metadata on the action as well. And attributes could also describe relationships. That's actually really interesting, and that's actually something that in the past with RBAC was pretty tough to do. In RBAC, you would say you have a role, and you have a group, and you have a department, and then in your code, you could say, you could define things about your resources, about your documents, but expressing the relationship between the user and between the document, or the user and the targeted resource was actually pretty hard. That's where you had your if, then else. But in ABAC, you can very much compare, say, the location of a user to the location of a document and say, oh, if both locations are equal, then access is permitted. I like to say that ABAC, or attribute-based access control, helps you define the 5 W's in the H. So that's just another way of saying user, resource, action, environment. So it's who, what, where, when, why, and how. That pretty much covers it all in terms of authorization, in terms actually of life, if you like. Yeah, ABAC can do life. So who is trying to access the resource? What is it they're trying to access? Is it a sensitive document? Is it a medical record? Is it an insurance claim? Where are they doing it from? Are they at home? Are they within the office? Are they on the VPN network? When are they doing it? Is it 3 in the morning? Or is it during day hours? Is it between 9 a.m., 5 p.m.? Why are they doing it? The why is actually really important. It defines the purpose of use. And very often, the purpose of use will determine whether an access is a valid access or an invalid access. Think of a doctor-patient relationship. Your doctor might be a friend of yours. So within the 9 to 5 boundaries at the hospital, your friend, who's also your doctor, can view your medical record. But if you bump into him or her at a party, that doctor, who's your friend, should not be able to view your medical record at 2 in the morning when you're drinking brandy or scotch or whatever it is your doctor drinks. And conversely, the doctor shouldn't drink when they're operating on you. That's not a very good thing to do. So attributes are great. Attributes can describe everything, but in themselves, they're not enough. I mean, fine, you can say that a user has this clearance, that they live in the state of Illinois, that they're over the age of 21, that so on and so forth. You can describe the user, and you can do the same to a resource, again, and you can do the same to the action. You can do the same to the environment. Great, so you've described the picture. So what? What next? How do you bind it all together? What is the secret sauce that you're going to use to bring your attributes to life and to give them meaning, to give them authorization meaning? Well, that secret sauce is not sweet and sour sauce, and it's a very misleading picture. It's actually policy-based access control. In a way, PBAC and ABAC are the same thing. You might see the two terms being used interchangeably, but ABAC and policy-based access control, PBAC, are pretty much the same, with the difference that ABAC focuses much more on how you describe the situation, how you describe the user, the resource, the action, and the environment, versus PBAC defining how, instead of writing code within your app, you will actually define policies that will use those attributes to describe an authorization situation. How many people have heard of PBAC before? policy-based access control. So some of the benefits of using a policy approach, a policy-driven approach, is that number one, it's extensible. You've defined a policy, and your policy caters for one use case. And then further down the road, your manager says, oh, we've got new authorization use cases. Not a problem. You write a new policy, and then you combine the two policies together. Extensible. Centralized. One of the issues with spaghetti code, other than the fact that it's pretty messy, is that you're going to have code in all your different applications that do authorization. So then, if you want to change your authorization requirements, you have to update 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different applications. So it's time consuming. It's also really hard to audit what your authorization is because your code is in different applications. With policy-based access control, you get a chance to bring it all together into one location. So you've centralized the authorization logic as policies into one location. Number 3, PBAC lets you standardize authorization. And there's a standard out there for it. It's XACML, XACML, and we'll get to it in a minute. Number 4, PBAC makes it easier to audit your authorization because it's centralized, because it's written in an almost English way. So all you have to do is look at the policy, read the policy, and you understand what it does, versus trying to parse if-else statements or code or switch statements or God knows how your developers have written the authorization logic in the first place. That makes it harder to understand. And finally, it's attribute-based, of course. The policies in themselves, if they were a vendor-specific policy format using a very specific set of techniques, the policies wouldn't be as valuable. But if you decide that you're going to write your policies based on attributes, and if you have a clear definition of what an attribute is, then it becomes much clearer and much more useful to use PBAC. And behold, XACML. It's a very aggressive red slide. I didn't think about that. I hope no one is colorblind. XACML stands for Extensible Access Control Markup Language. You can forget the markup language and just focus on extensible access control. Again, extensible because you can add new policies, you can add new scenarios, you can express many different types of authorization use cases. XACML is defined by OASIS, the same people who define SAML and all the WS security standards. And there are a few different implementations, both on the vendor side and open source implementations that you can have a look at. XACML binds together attributes, ABAC, and policy-based access control, PBAC. So with XACML, you can express your fine-grained authorization requirements. And I don't know, for those of you who were around yesterday, you might have seen Paul Mattson's T-shirt that had a cat on it, Schrodinger's Cat. And for those of you not familiar with that cat, we don't really know if he's alive or she or it, depending on whether you're British or American. It is alive or dead. That's Schrodinger's cat. Well, I'm glad to say that it doesn't really matter in XACML and attribute-based access control, because as it turns out, attributes can have two values. I mean, after all, you could have two roles within the enterprise. You could be a manager and a consultant, right? Well, it's the same is true of the cat. Hers. Ooh, that's complicated. Life could either be alive or dead at the same time, because you can have two values. As to whether it makes any sense is a different question. But yes, I'm glad to say that XACML supports Paul Mattson's cat. I'm sure he's relieved to know that. So with XACML, you can bake your authorization in layers. Now we're going back to the lasagna versus spaghetti analogy. And what it means is that you can actually insert the authorization where it makes most sense. Now if you think about an architecture, if you think about your applications, you have a presentation tier, you have the mobile client, you have your business logic, you have your APIs, and at the very end, very often you'll have your data tier. What's important with externalized authorization with XACML is that you can, since you decouple the authorization logic from the business logic, then what you can do is have the authorization over there on one side, and at the different layers where it matters to you, you can put interceptors, little clients, that will call out to the external authorization service. So you can effectively achieve the same consistent, coherent authorization no matter anywhere within the architecture, the presentation tier, API, web app, business, and data tier. It also means that in the presentation tier, you might use the authorization more from a safety or usability, user experience angle. You might want to show or hide menu items or buttons depending on what a user can do. But it is by no means security per se, because a user, a malicious user, I heard that they exist, could always circumvent the presentation tier, go back down to the API, and hack their way through there. So you always want to do authorization at the right layer, but also in depth. Don't think that because you've done it in the presentation tier, you're good. No, you want to do both presentation, API, and eventually all the way down to the data tier. Very often, of course, the closer you are to what you care about, your data, the better you're protecting it. And this is what you would end up having. Yeah, you're missing part of the picture, aren't you? Oh, well. If you drew it out from a more technical perspective, you get these different layers. And on each one of those layers, you can go ahead and have an interceptor. In XACML, that's called an enforcement point. But let's forget the technical terms. All it does is intercept the flow, create an authorization request from the business request, send it off to your externalized authorization engine, get a decision from there, and enforce that decision back in the code. Your policies live here. So before we move on to the demo part of the workshop, any questions? No questions? So everyone knows Chef Gable? I'm really amazed. So Chef Gable is right over there, by the way. So if you have any cuisine questions, he's the go-to man. So the main question is, all this theory, all this XACML, all this externalized authorization, it's all nice and well, but if it's really enterprisey, if it's heavy duty, if it's hard to do, what good is it for me? What good is it for my APIs or for my applications? Well, the reason I'm here today is that that Chef Gable is here today, I guess, is that he's found the secret to making perfect authorization, to baking perfect authorization into the apps in a very simple way. And the first tip is that he uses alpha. Has anyone heard of alpha before? All right, one person. Alpha is a Greek letter. So, I mean, most people learn the alphabet when they're 5, but joke aside, alpha is the axiomatics language for authorization. It's a simplified version. It's a pseudocode for XACML. XACML is a language that's based on XML. So some of you like XML. It's great. Some of you don't. Either way, you would never write XACML in pure text. That's suicidal. And behold, alpha. Alpha is a neat little easy way to write your authorization policies, and I'll show you how to do that. But that's only one of 3 tools. There's 2 additional tools we'll use. And the first one is JSON, and the other one is REST. So within the XACML technical committee, we've defined a lightweight notation for an authorization request and an authorization response, and we've encoded that into JSON. And the main benefit, really, is not so much the encoding. After all, you don't really care what format you use to send the request, but it makes writing the authorization request so much easier. And we'll get to that as well in a demo. So first things first, the Alpha plugin for Eclipse. And that's a bit like the KitchenAid of chefs or cooks. What's Alpha? Abbreviated or axiomatics language for authorization. We've actually donated the grammar to Oasis, so now it's being called abbreviated language for authorization. We tried to find a really long acronym so we could abbreviate it really well. Oasis, like I said, is the organization behind XACML. So we're developing new versions of Alpha, new versions of the grammar within Oasis. The 1.0 standard will probably come out towards the end of the year. We're finishing up the draft, and if all goes well, it should be standardized by the end of the year. Its goal is really, the first audience we had in mind when we developed Alpha was the developer. We wanted a tool where the developer could actually very quickly write policies, very complex, very rich policies and attribute definitions, write them, and be able to deploy the policy very quickly. It makes the syntax much easier. It simplifies the structure of XACML. It gives you a bit more possibilities than raw XACML does. Initially, like I said, we aimed it at developers. What we realized, though, with both customers, prospects, academia, people using it, is that business analysts and architects also like it very much because it's so easy to use. The way it works is that we have a plugin for it, and it plugs straight into Eclipse, the developer IDE. And what it gives you, of course, is the usual stuff you would expect of an IDE: autocomplete, syntax checking, syntax coloring. And it converts alpha directly into XACML 3.0 policies that are ready to be deployed on your favorite authorization engine. You can also do policy testing with it. So, and it is available free from Axiomatics. If you want to grab a copy, you can ask Sharon over there in yellow. She'll give you one, if you're nice. Let's have a look at a use case, an insurance use case. A lot of the customers that we talk to today that use externalized authorization, that use ABAC, are customers with relatively complex authorization scenarios. Banks, insurance companies, pharmaceutical, the heavy industry, the likes of aircraft manufacturing, they all have very complex authorization needs. The use case I'll use here is an insurance use case. So the first thing you want to do is define your authorization requirement. Example: a customer can view his or her own policies and the policies of a spouse that are not marked as private, actually. Let me change that. There we go. Typical use case. I didn't come up with it. A customer gave it to me. And I really like this use case, other than the fact that since they use the word policy, I always get confused between the authorization policy and the insurance policy. Clearly here we're talking about the insurance policy. So fine. I'll take my authorization requirement, and I'll go to my Eclipse plugin, and I'll go ahead and define that. So here I'll say a customer can view their own insurance policy. Here, I just wrote it in plain old English. And then since there were two parts to the role, I'm going to write another one here. A customer can view the insurance policy of their spouse if and only if the policy is not marked as private. Okay? So these are the two policies. Now, once you've defined the authorization requirement, you want to identify your attributes. So in this example, the sort of attributes that we're dealing with are user type, the customer, that's a user type, the action is view, the policy owner, who owns the policy, okay? The private flag of the policy, whether the policy is marked as public or private, the spouse of the requesting user, the object we're dealing with, an insurance policy, and the user identity as well, the user's name. Once you've identified your attributes, you can go back to the Alpha plugin and define them, and we're going to define them one by one. And when we're done defining the attributes, we can rework the policy and pepper in our attributes. So let's all do that together live. So this is Alpha. This is Eclipse, by the way, for those of you not familiar with Eclipse. And I'm going to go ahead and start with my first policy here, my own policy. And I'm going to define the scope of the policy. So target clause, I'm going to create an attribute called resource type is equal to insurance policy. So you can see that it's almost like writing English. It's fairly straightforward. And user type is going to be equal to customer. And I'm going to have a role allow own policies. And in there, I'm going to say condition user ID is equal to the owner of the policy. going to add the action ID as well. So I'm going to say target clause action ID is equal to view. And that's a very, very simple policy that we've just written together. It takes 5 lines of code, and in those 5 lines, you've defined a relatively advanced authorization use case without writing one single line of Java, .NET, Python, Ruby, whatever. This is an external policy that you will maintain externally. Now, we're not done. You can see that my Eclipse is complaining, so there's a bunch of errors that we need to sort out. And of course, the main error here is that we've defined words that it doesn't know what they mean. I mean, what is a resource type? We haven't defined that anywhere yet. And the same goes for the other attributes. So right before my policy, I could do it in a separate file as well, but I'll do it here. I'm going to define my attributes. So I'm going to say attribute resource type. And attributes in XACML are defined in terms of 3 things. An identifier, data type. Is it string? Is it Boolean? Is it a number? So on and so forth. And a category. What does it relate to? Does it describe the subject? Does it describe the resource? Does it describe the action? So here, resource type describes the resource. The ID is going to be resource type. And the type is going to be string. Okay? And then, since I'm a little lazy, I'm going to do a bit of copy pasting, and I'm going to go ahead and define user type. And that's going to be the subject category. And I'm going to let that be a string. And now I'm missing the action ID. It's going to be action category. Make that a string as well. What else do we need? We need a user ID, and we need a policy owner. Okay. And now we need a policy owner. That's going to be a resource attribute. And now if we go back down to the policy, you can see that now it's pretty happy. It's working. And what the policy says, if we read it again in plain old English, is that the policy will apply to anything that is an insurance policy. It will apply it to customers. And it will allow access. It will say permit if and only if the action is view, and if the user ID is equal to the policy owner. This here is a relationship. I like to call that relationship-based access control. This is something that in RBAC or in other authorization models was pretty much impossible to do unless you actually wrote code within your apps. And then you were at the mercy of the developers to make sure they were actually doing it correctly. Now, we're not done yet because we've written one policy, but we might want to write the second policy. We might want to extend the scenario to cater for the spouse use case. And actually, if you think about it, the 2 policies are going to share the same target, right? We're still going to be talking about insurance policy, and you're still a customer. So in fact, what I can do is make that a rule and go ahead and insert the spouse policy here. So now I'm referencing my rule from another policy, which is great because suddenly I don't need to re-implement this target. And since I'm a little lazy, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the following here. The action ID is going to be the same. And now the user ID is going to be equal to, the policy owner is going to be equal to the spouse. It doesn't know what spouse is, so go ahead and define the spouse attribute. And now the policy works. Now, is that actually, does that match the use case that we had? Are we done? Or are we missing something? Private, yep. So now we can say, and private is equal to false. And it's complaining, of course. So go back, copy one of the resource attributes, make it private, change that to Boolean, and now we're done. Now there's a couple of things I could do to optimize my example. For instance, I use action ID equals view twice. So that's an indication that I might actually want to move it here. And then get rid of this. So now I've got a little cleaner example. Similarly, if I don't want to reference the rule, I could actually just move it inside here. Any questions on the example? Make sense? Was that painful? Very painful. Does that look like we're baking lasagna, or are you a bit disappointed there's not enough meat? So that was alpha. That actually got converted into a XACL 3.0 policy. So as a matter of fact, we can inspect the policy here. If you open this folder up on the fly, it's converted it to XML. We could actually look at it. Now that's going to hurt your eyes. You've been warned. Actually not that bad. This is what the raw source looks like. So given a choice between writing a policy in this or in alpha, I think the choice is pretty easy to make. And I know we have some XML gurus in the audience today, but even so, I think it would be painful. Okay. So moving on now to tool number 2 that Chef Gable likes to use in the kitchen. And that's broccoli, because broccoli is super healthy. The JSON profile of XACL. So within the technical committee at Oasis, we defined the policy language, we defined the architecture, we defined the request response scheme, but we really never defined a transport protocol. So you could actually send the authorization request, the XACL request. You could send it over a carrier pigeon if you wanted to. That was valid. You could send it over XML. You could send it over whatever you like. And we decided that the fact that you could choose your language and your protocol, it kind of hindered adoption, because then people would do their own stuff everywhere. So we figured, let's standardize both the encoding and the transport mechanism. And let's also make it easy. Let's choose something that's really easy to write and something that developers like. So we picked JSON. And we started the work on the JSON profile about a year and a half ago, 2 years. It is a technical committee, so things move a bit slowly sometimes. And we're pretty much done with the profile. It's going to be standardized within the next couple months. There's a couple typos that need to be fixed. And today you're actually going to see the first ever live demo, if all goes well. I shouldn't say that. I'm going to jinx myself. And the goal of the JSON request response protocol is to, number one, provide a lightweight notation, much lighter than XML is. Get rid of the verboseness of XML. You know how in XML you do angle brackets, element, slash angle brackets, the element. That's very verbose. Also, you want to get rid of the verboseness of XACL itself. XML was one thing, the encoding was one thing, but XACL also is extremely verbose. It puts in a lot of information that, in fact, you could actually skip, omit, if you have natural defaults. You want something that's easy to write. So the good thing about JSON is that if you use JavaScript, you can actually write a JSON client or a JSON object without actually having an SDK. You just write it on the fly. That's pretty cool. And we'll do that together just now. You also want, we wanted an encoding that had better support. I mean, XML is great when you're in Java, when you're in .NET. But when you use other languages like Python, Ruby, PHP, or even smaller languages, the support for XML, the parsing of XML is not always that great. So some of the basics of the JSON profile is, number one, it respects pretty closely the principle of XACL. We have not invented a new way of asking a question. You still send the same authorization request. It's a yes-no question, and you still get back a yes or a no. The only things we've done really is shrink it, is skip the stuff that you can skip, If there's information that typically a XACML request or response would contain, but that doesn't really matter to the developer or to the decision-making process, skip it. Don't put it in. There's no point. Have some default names. So instead of having everything defined in terms of abstract attributes, give your attributes a good name, like subject, resource, action, environment. And you're back on, if you think from a grammar perspective, you're back on the subject, subject, verb, object, and the rest. So here's an example of how you would write a JSON client in JavaScript. It's pretty simple. You start off with a new object, a new JavaScript object. It's not strongly typed. We'll do that as we go. And then we're going to create a subject part or member to that request object. And then within that subject, we'll add attributes. And how do you define attributes? You give it an ID, and you give it a value. And you skip the data type. Why? Well, because if it's string, why specify that it's string? Just assume that it's string. So this is what it does. So instead of defining attributes in terms of 3, potentially 4 parts, you define attributes in terms of 2 different things. And eventually, you take your attribute, and you go ahead and add it to your attribute object within the subject category within the JSON request. Simple as that. So if we look at what it looks like in code, this is a very simple HTML page that I wrote up on my way over to Monterey. So what it has is a bit of HTML markup. It has an authorized method, and the authorized method, all it does is connect to my backend server that exposes the JSON API. It sends the request, it authenticates, and please do not try to memorize my password. It sets a bunch of request headers, so application XACML plus JSON. It sends off the authorization request, and that's pretty much it. Now, if you look a little further below, here is where I build my XACML request. So I create my access subject category, I create my resource category, my action category, my environment category, and then I create attributes below, my user ID, my user ID's value, the role of my user, the ticker in this particular example, so on and so forth. Great. Now if we try that, here's the little front end. Let me refresh the page. And this is my JSON request, serialized into text. And if I go ahead and click on submit, it's going to send an authorization request to my service, and it will reply with a response. So I'll do that. And the response that I get back here is a permit. You can see the cute little permit icon, as well as the raw response. If you want to see the nitty-gritty details of what a XACML response looks like, this is what it looks like. And you can actually see here that even in this JSON response, there's a lot of information that you can care less. So you can, in JSON, you can say, skip parts of the information, focus on what matters most, the decision, in this case, permit. So let's go ahead and deploy the policy we wrote together. Let's see how that impacts my little example here. Right now, we're getting a permit. If I deploy my policy, so I'm going to upload my policy to my authorization domain. Here it is. Click apply. My policy is now live. If I go back to my little demo and I click submit, I get deny. Or actually, I get access is not allowed. But in fact, if you look at the response, I'm getting not applicable. Meaning, you're sending an authorization request about a ticker and about John, who's a manager, to an authorization service that has a policy about insurance policies. Of course, you're going to get not applicable. The request does not match the policy. So let's go ahead and fix that. If I go back to my HTML page, I'm going to say, what did I have in my policy? I'm going to have a user type. So user type is a new object. And my user type attribute ID is going to be user type. Let me go back up. Yeah, user type. It's case sensitive, so you want to make sure that you get the case right. And here's my attribute. User type.value is equal to customer. What else do we need? we need a resource type. Okay? So here, let me actually delete all these attributes. Var resource type is a new object, and my resource type dot attribute ID is going to be resource type. My resource type dot value is going to be insurance policy. What else do we need? Resource type, user type, action ID. So var action ID is equal to new object, action ID dot attribute ID is equal to view. Action ID dot value is equal to, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Value is equal to view. Okay. What else do we need? We need a user ID and we need a policy owner. So var user ID, var policy owner is equal to new object, user ID dot attribute ID is equal to user ID, and value is equal to Alice. And then policy owner dot attribute ID is equal to policy owner. Policy owner dot value is equal to Alice as well. Great. Now I need to put in my attributes into my request object. So I'm going to have user type. I'm going to have user ID. In the resource, I'm going to have resource type. And I'm going to have as well policy owner. In the action, I'm going to have action ID. And I think we're good. Any typos, any mistakes that you might have seen? Looks good? Semicolon where? That one. Okay. Let's give that a go. So if I refresh my page, I now get a request with my different attributes. So you can see the attribute ID, user type, the value is customer, user ID is Alice. Then you have the resource section with the resource type and a value of insurance policy. And then a policy owner of a value of Alice. And then the action with an attribute ID of action ID and a value of view. So if all goes well, if I send that over, if I didn't make any mistake in my JSON, I should get a permit. And I do. Great, perfect. So this is how fast and easy it was to actually write an enforcement point. That's called an enforcement point in the XACTable terminology. It took me from 106 down to 127, 21 lines of code to write that simple little client without using an SDK, without using any fancy library you would have gotten from a vendor or an open source implementation. This is pure JavaScript. I'm not using Node.js or anything. It's pure JavaScript. Now, if I change my owner from Alice to Bob, and I click submit, now I'm getting deny. As a matter of fact, I'm getting not applicable because I don't have any specific rule that says deny. So it just goes to not applicable, and you're not getting access. So this is the neat thing with JSON. It makes it so much easier, so much faster to actually write an authorization request, send it off to the authorization service, get a decision back, and enforce the decision. And the way you extract the decision is really easy as well. Let me go back to my authorization method. All you have to do is read this. JSON response, .response.decision. That actually gives you whether it's a permit, a deny, a not applicable, an indeterminate. And you're done. It's extremely easy, very lightweight. going back to cooking and lasagna and spaghetti, the fact that you're using JSON, and broccoli, of course, the fact that you're using JSON means that you're gonna lose a lot of weight. It's much lighter. I did a quick comparison. This is actually from a year ago. And I'd written a XACML request in XML. And then I wrote it in JSON, and the lightest possible way in JSON. And I counted the words. It's not a very scientific method. And then I counted the characters. And you can see that JSON is much, much lighter than the XACML equivalent, the XML equivalent is. So it does mean that you might see a little performance gain on the network transport, but that's not the main takeaway. The main takeaway is that it's just easier for developers to write. So the last tool in Chef Gable's set of kitchen tools is the REST profile of XACML. So now you've encoded it. Now you need to send it. And as it turns out, and again, I said that before, but in the XACML technical committee, we never actually defined a standardized way to actually send a XACML request and get a response back. We defined the format, but never the actual transport. We did define 5+ years ago a way to transport a XACML request over a SAML. But that was actually really heavy duty. And then you had to sign the whole SAML, and there was crypto involved, and people got scared and ran away. So we figured we're going to do a lasagna tray. So the idea with the REST profile is, well, it's super simple. You either take XML or JSON, and you post it to the REST URL, and you get back the REST response. It couldn't get any easier than that. And in the example you saw that, I used the XML HTTP request object and JavaScript. You just post the content, and you're done with it. No questions asked. And the way to post it, of course, is just to use this little guy here and make sure that you set it to post in your code. And then you need a set of request headers to define the content that you're sending, to define what you're expecting. Because as a matter of fact, that might sound weird, but you can send JSON and get XML back. As to why you would do that, I don't know, but it's actually allowed by the profile. You can actually send JSON, get an XML response back. And that's it. So if you look at it, if you go to the code, if you go to the endpoint, this is my endpoint. So if I do a GET request to it, it tells me, OK, this is the endpoint where you want to post your authorization request. Simple. So we have an add-in link here that you can follow. And I got to say, I should have put this slide before, but let's just change the wording. And now we have baked. And move on. So now, any questions before we wrap up?
So a lot of these use cases I see are wrapped around building authorization policies into web apps specifically. We have a very large infrastructure built around services and XACML. And how do you see this integrating with technologies like Service Bus and some of these other backend operations that are going to support these?
Extremely well. So if you go back very quickly to, that was the quick answer, extremely well. If you go back really quickly to the AnyDepth slide, if I can find it. The point, one of the main points of XACML is its architecture and the fact that you've decoupled the business logic from the authorization logic. And it means that you can apply the same authorization logic to any layer within the architecture. So you can do it within APIs and web services, and that is historically the home turf of XHTML. That is where it works best. But you can also do it on ESBs, absolutely. And that's still, ESBs and business enterprise buses, they're pretty similar to web services anyway, so it works extremely well. And you can even move it down to the data tier. That's more novel. But we can actually intercept SQL statements, inspect them, and then change them so that when you go to the database to retrieve data, the data that you retrieve is only entitled data. And that's actually it's the coolest way to do it, because if you have like 5 different services in your API tier or in your enterprise service bus, if you protect the backend database, then you don't need to touch the services at all, because they all go to the same database. So actually, in one go, you've protected everything else. Yep, that's true of the enterprise service bus. So there is one caveat. You're right. You need to be able to rain down the identity from the presentation tier all the way down to the database somehow. You need to find a way. But there's actually, so in the database world, if you look at drivers and how you establish connections, there are means to traverse, to send the identity of the end user down. And a lot of what we found is, we were really concerned at first when we came up with the ability to intercept databases. We were like, oh, this is so cool. And then we were like, oh, but we don't know who we're dealing with. And then we started talking to customers and investigating. And a lot of the customers in highly sensitive industries, they already send down the user identity to the backend database for logging and audit purposes. So they already have that information. So then we can piggyback on that fact and do authorization there. Any other questions? Okay. So let me go speed back up to the very end. So forget spaghetti and go for lasagna. Much cleaner. And the way to do it is to combine REST, Alpha, and JSON. It's really, finally, I mean, XACML has been branded in the past for being too enterprisey, too heavyweight, too not practical for the app developer. Well, if you use this trilogy of REST, Alpha, and JSON, then you get a good recipe for success. And I'd like to call it the good, and the good, you know, in reference to Sergio Leone. And of course, if you need some recommendations in terms of how to pair your lasagna with a good bottle of Californian wine, then you can ask our chef, Gable, who can help you with that. And I'll just want to summarize with these quick terms that I used in the slides. But these are important terms. EAM, Externalized Authorization Management. This is what Gartner calls our field, the field of externalized authorization. You might see the term dynamic access control as well. ABAC, attribute-based access control. PBAC, policy-based access control, bringing the attributes together in a policy to make sense. And eventually XACML, which today is pretty much the only standardized effort around PBAC and ABAC. A couple of references. You can get all the information on REST, JSON, and Alpha from the OASIS XACML Technical Committee site, as well as from the Axiomatics website if you want to get a copy of the Alpha plugin. And on that note, thank you very much, and bon appétit.